This is part 2 of the lecture on the legislature. And in part 1, I introduced the legislative leadership, which I defined as the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, and the committee chairs. And so in this lecture, I am going to be telling you about these presiding officers, this legislative leadership, and what makes them so powerful. And basically, there's two parts to this particular issue of what makes them so powerful. One is called the procedural tools, the other one are the institutional tools. So we're going to be talking about these. Okay, specifically in this lecture, we are going to be talking about the legislative process, which is how a bill becomes a law, the different steps that it needs to take for a bill to become a law, the powers of the presiding officers, the procedural powers, and the institutional powers. Okay, let's talk first about the legislative process. And so the legislative process is basically how a bill is going to be introduced, how it's going to be advanced, whether or not it's going to be able to report out of the committee to be heard on the floor, and for the legislators to vote it up or down. So it's a whole process that we're going to be talking about. And so this provides some type of order, and each chamber has a little bit different way of doing things. So we'll be talking about each of the chambers, and the chambers are the House of Representatives and the Texas Senate. And so these particular bills are introduced, and they are the proposed legislation, the bills introduced are handled by a substantive policy issue committee. A substantive policy issue committee. And so what that means is that if there's a bill that's going to be introduced, that's a bill on, say, for example, education, it should go to a committee that handles the legislation responsible for educational bills. Okay, I'm going to be talking to you about numerous different committees that are set up and the reasons that they're set up. The first one that I want to talk about are standing committees or permanent committees. These are the ones that are there all the time when the legislature is in session, and there's really no party philosophy. It's just a committee that has to be there. And these committees are committees on, for example, the Committee on Transportation, the Committee on Education, the Committee on Environment, on Healthcare, whatever. But these are committees that are going to be looking at the bills when they're introduced to see what needs to be done. Okay, so these committees can be kind of large. They can have like maybe 15 to 18 to maybe 20 different legislators on there, especially the House of Representatives. And what they have to do is they have to say, well, you know what, we need a smaller group. We need a smaller group to be able to look at these bills and decide, you know, we're going to go ahead and support them or not support them or whatever. So this one is called a subcommittee. So it's a division of the standing committee, but a smaller number that are going to be actually looking at the bill, because they're going to be considering those bills within their areas of specialization. Another type of committee is called a conference committee. And so the conference committee comes more towards the end, but this is the one that says, okay, if two bills are passed by each of the chambers, then only one bill can be voted on to find out if we're going to pass it or not, and for it to advance to the governor. So the governor can look at it, sign it, veto it, whatever he's going to do. And so that particular committee is a conference committee, and so it will resolve the differences by the bills that are passed in each of the chambers if they are very different, because only one bill can go on to the governor. So the conference committee resolves these differences, comes up with a joint resolution, a joint bill, and then it goes back to the floor. All right, I talked about the powers of the presiding officers, and so this is going to start to tell you where they derive their powers from. Why are they such powerful positions? And one of them is related to the procedural powers, everything that deals with this legislative process that I was talking about, how the bill becomes a law. And the other one has to do with the institutional powers, and this is related to the administrative policy and management, or the oversight functions that the legislature has over many different areas. Okay, so the procedural powers themselves come from the rules of the House, and so you're probably going to be pretty unfamiliar with this with these rules, but there are formal rules and there are informal rules, and we're not really going to get too much into these rules, but the rules will say either we're going to allow this to be filibustered in case of there's it's a Senate committee, or we're not going to allow this to be filibustered. So uh, there are certain rules that can be invoked to try to either pass a bill or keep it from being passed. Another power that they have is that they will appoint the committee members for these standing committees, the conference committees. They're going to appoint these members, and they're going to appoint the committee chairs. They will assign all of the bills to the committees. And as I said before, there are this numerous, I mean, voluminous pieces of legislation. Thousands of bills are going to be assigned. And so you should be asking yourself, do all these bills really get looked at? I mean, can any human person actually look at that many bills? They will schedule legislation for floor action, and that doesn't make sense right now, but we'll be talking about the floor in a little bit. And they will appoint the chairs and the members of the conference committees. So all of these deal with how laws are going to get passed. Those are all the procedural tools, how these laws are going to get passed or get killed. Then the institutional powers, that these are non-procedural activities. And so there are four different quasi-governmental institutions that help the legislature. I'll talk about these more when I talk about the institutional tools of leadership, but briefly, it's the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the house. The lieutenant governor serves as chair, the speaker serves as vice chair, and they are responsible for selecting who's going to be serving on different committees for these institutions, these quasi-governmental organizations. One of them is the Legislative Budget Board, that has everything to do with the Texas budget. The other one is the Legislative Council, that provides research support. The Legislative Audit Committee is the other one, which looks at expenditures and audits the different state agencies. And then the last one is the Sunset Advisory Commission, that provides oversight and evaluation for all of the state agencies on a regular cycle. So as I said, we're going to talk more about these when I cover the part on the institutional tools of leadership more towards the end of this lecture. So let's talk about the procedural tools first. Okay, I talked about the committees, and the importance of the committee membership is this. Whoever's serving on the committees is going to look at a piece of legislation. They are going to recommend that it be passed or not be passed. They can change it. I mean, there's many ways that a bill can be changed along the way. But the important part is this: it influences the way that the laws are going to be coming out. It influences policy decisions, how laws are going to come out, whether they're going to be more conservative or whether they're going to be more liberal, because each substantive issue area has at least two ways to look at it. One's more conservative and one's more liberal. So it depends on who's sitting on that committee. That's the way that those laws are going to be reported out and how the legislators are going to vote them in. So the Speaker of the House for the House of Representatives will appoint people to the Appropriations Committee as well as the Budget and Oversight Committee. Now what happens is that the House of Representatives has what's called the power of the purse. So they have everything to do with the money part, the power of the purse. And so what they will do is that what the Speaker will do is that he will appoint an ambassador to these substantive committees, like the one on education or the one on healthcare or whatever, and say, so that he can say, okay, this is what they're thinking about doing, this is how much they think it's going to cost. Or he might say, I'm sorry, we don't have that much money, you're going to have to kind of like gear back, your expenditures on this particular program or whatever. So it's somebody that doesn't really vote, but that can give them some type of advice on the budgeting part of it. Then the lieutenant governor in the Senate will appoint all of the Senate committees and all of the permanent subcommittees within the Senate. And so when it comes to the Senate, there's more of an informal seniority system. It's not as formal as it is at the U.S. level, like the congressional level, but there is kind of an informal seniority system, whereas the more senior senators are going to serve on the more powerful, the more important committees, because they have the experience, they have the expertise, they've put their time in. And so the way that this legislative leadership operates is that they will go ahead and assign committee appointments to reward people that have been supportive of their agenda, their legislative agenda, and to punish their opponents that have not been supportive of their legislative agenda. So again, the committee appointments are kind of looked at as a prize, that if you work with the legislative leadership, if you are supportive of the legislative leadership, you're going to get put on better, more powerful committees. If you're not, they're going to put you on really crummy committees. So when it comes to the selection of the chairs of the committee, so you have a committee and you have to have one person that's going to kind of lead the group, right? And so it's going to be the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor that is going to select the chair of the committee as well. And so the importance of the committee chair is that he's going to provide the policy direction. Is it going to be more conservative? Is it going to be more liberal? You know, how these laws should be designed, how they should be crafted, whether it's going to be more liberal in the way that they look at it, or if it's going to be more conservative in the way that they look at it. Now, the committee chair is almost always coming from the party, the majority party, but not always. Not always. There are some powerful committees out there that are being chaired or at least co-chaired by someone from the minority party. So it's not particularly based on ideology, but it's usually because the appointments are bipartisan. There's got to be people from both parties that are going to be represented on that committee, and they tend to be more conservative to moderate. Democrats and Republicans are usually the ones in control, and maybe that's changed just a little bit because we elected so many Tea Party members in the last midterm elections, or the last time they had elections here in the state of Texas. We had a lot more Tea Party members coming in. So and we just elected a lieutenant governor that's very Tea Party as well. So that may change in the future. We'll just have to see how that goes. Okay, this one is important. And I'm not sure that the book covers this. I don't think I saw it in the book this time, but let me tell you something about the state of Texas. You know, I mentioned that there are voluminous pieces of legislature, thousands of pieces of legislature that get introduced every session. Well, the thing is this: in Texas, committee jurisdiction is poorly defined. That's another way of saying, you know what, if bills get introduced for many different reasons. And it should be that when a bill is introduced, that it should go to the committee that handles that particular substantive issue area. Like if it's going to be a bill on transportation, it should go to the committee that handles the legislation or the substantive issue area of transportation. But because Texas has a very poorly defined committee jurisdiction system, it doesn't always work that way. The bills are assigned based on whether or not the legislative leadership want them to pass or not. I'll say that again. Depends on whether the legislative leadership wants these bills to actually pass, to come out of the committee, to report out of the committee. They want them to pass or not. Okay, sometimes these presiding officers, this legislative leadership, may oppose a bill for many different reasons. One, they're saying, well, you know, if we pass this bill, I think that it might be a threat to their economic or political well-being. But they go ahead and introduce it anyway because it might be that their constituency, and I don't know if I've defined that word or not, constituency means the people that they are representing, the ones that voted them in. They might want them, they might really be pushing for a bill, really be pushing for something, and they're saying, well, you know what, if I don't introduce this bill, I'm not going to get voted in again. So I have to introduce this bill. And so what they'll happen, you know, he will go and talk to the presiding officers or whatever, and they'll introduce the bill, but they're going to assign it to a committee that they know is going to be defeated. And so they will say, well, I mean, and then that particular legislator can say, hey, I introduced the bill, but it was killed in committee. It was killed in committee, so the committee takes the blame. It might also be that a bill is introduced, but if the presiding officers feel that this particular person sponsoring this bill, introducing this bill, has not been supportive of the legislative leadership, they'll go ahead and assign it to a committee that they know is going to kill the bill. So it's used to punish uncooperative supporters of the bill. So some of these negotiations could include some promises to change the bill, such as, well, okay, this is the bill, I don't like this part. Can we replace it with that part? I need to take this part out or whatever. So you can change the bill. Once it goes into a committee, you can change the bill. And so it's going to be changed in the way that it's going to be that the legislative leadership is going to be supportive of it. So it's got to be favored by the legislative leadership. And if it's going to be opposed by the legislative leadership, then it's going to be defeated. So as I said, there's a lot of political brokering, that's what's called, a lot of compromise that goes on. And so well, you should be getting the idea already that the legislative leadership is very powerful in that way, because whether or not these legislators are going to be supportive of this legislative leadership is going to kind of define whether or not they're going to be successful legislators and getting legislation passed. Okay, so then we get to the committees and the little legislature. So they go into these little subcommittees, and these are the ones that actually do the work. They conduct the real legislative business of compromise and accommodation. So this is where they do the work, the legislative work. So this is the things that they can do. They can mark up bills, and by marking up, what that means is that they can rewrite the bills. They can add sections or delete sections to the bill. Or they can pigeonhole the bill, which means it's buried in committee, which means that bill is killed. It will never report out of committee. You'll never hear of it again. So that's one way. That's the first way that these bills can be killed. And so, the rest of the legislature will never hear about it because it never reports out of committee. Remember that term. It never reports out of committee. And so what they do in these is that there is a division of labor, and so the bill is assigned to a committee. I just told you about that. Another thing that they do there is that they will take witness or testimony for and against the bill. So let me give you an example of this one. We recently had a bill that was introduced and passed, but it was not supported by many of the campuses, the college campuses, and this had to deal with the campus carry legislation that will be going into effect. All right, this campus carry, when you go back and you kind of research that particular bill, it was supported by the legislators, but it was not supported by their constituency. It was not supported by the law enforcement community. It was not supported by the campus community. It was not supported by almost anyone else there. I went back and I looked at it to kind of see what they were, and it doesn't tell you what they're talking about. You can find the list. It'll tell you this person, and then it'll tell you the organization. Whether it's the police officers or it's from UT Austin or whatever, it'll just tell you. That list was like several hundred people strong, of people that went and said, we don't want this bill. We don't want this bill. Well, it passed anyway, right? But anyway, so this is where they do this basic legislative work in the subcommittees. Another procedural tool that they have is that they will provide bureaucratic oversight and a bureaucracy. Let me tell you real quickly about a bureaucracy, because we're going to be talking more about this in the lecture on the executive office. The bureaucrats are basically the public agencies that will implement the programs that are going to be passed by the legislature. So the legislature passes a bill, the governor signs the bill, then it has to go to some type of state agency to implement the bill, to deliver the services. So that's kind of like a bureaucracy, because all of these state agencies are very large. All right, so the legislature acts as a watchdog over the bureaucracies. They have that oversight function over the bureaucracies, but in reality, the legislators are more advocates for the administrative agencies, these public agencies, and so there's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. And again, I'll talk more about this type of relationship, that the legislators, also help in the policy process and passing the laws when it comes to the state of Texas. But as I said, when I talk about the part on of the executive office, I'll talk more about that. All right, the next procedural tool is the calendar. And so the calendar is the instrument that's used to control how different pieces of legislation are going to be advancing to the floor, to control the flow of legislation from the committees to the floor. So basically, so it's gone through the committees, it's reported out of the committee. So they're saying, yes, we're going to support this bill. We're going to recommend passage of this bill. We're going to appropriate so much money for this bill. So it's gone through the committee and they favor. They say yes. So the next process it has to go through is through this calendar. So it's the instrument to say, okay, how is it going to get from the committee to the floor? So this is the function of the calendar. Okay, so the House calendar is controlled by the Speaker of the House, and there is a calendar committee. And our state rep Todd Hunter, the one for this area, is the one who chairs that particular committee. And so the chair of that committee schedules the bills, as he feels they should come out. So he has a lot of power in that way, is that he can say, I want this bill to go first before this other bill. And he says, you know what, I really don't like this bill, so I'm going to black hole it. So that's another way to kill that bill. So that's a second way. So you can pigeonhole it if it's in the committee, gets to the calendar, it can be black holed. Okay, the Senate has a little bit different way of advancing their legislation. Theirs is based more on chronological order. And so what that means is that a bill that is passed today is going to be heard before a bill that is going to be passed tomorrow. Unless, of course, they invoke the 2/3 rule. And so what this says is that, we want to hear a bill that's going to be coming out tomorrow, and before we hear this bill, the one that came out today, that was reported out today. But in order to do that, to take these bills out of sequence, they have to suspend the rule. And the way that they suspend the rule is that there needs to be 2/3 vote to say, yes, we want to suspend this rule and take this other bill out of order. Now, what happens a lot of time is that it's used as a mechanism to keep these bills advancing to the floor. Again, that's a way to delay. That's a way to kill that bill, that it'll never be heard, because they just keep suspending the rule and not really listening, not really taking that particular bill up, because it'll never get to the floor. Okay, so I keep talking about the floor and the floor and the floor. So let's talk about the floor then. The floor just means that this is where all of the rest of the legislators get to hear about what's going on with a particular bill, whether it be the one in the House of Representatives or it's the one in the Texas Senate, because they haven't seen the bill. It's only the committee that has seen the bill. So it gets to the floor, and the Constitution says that each bill must be read 3 times. And the reason it needs to be read 3 times is that there needs to be time in between the times that they read for them to look at the bill, to understand the bill, to debate the bill. And so upon the 3rd reading, it takes a simple majority to pass. The simple majority means 50% plus 1 vote. Okay, each of the chambers has a different way of doing it. When it comes to the floor of the House or the House of Representatives, the floor leader will introduce the bill. He'll kind of tell a little bit about the bill. He'll speak in favor of the bill. He will answer questions about the bill. And because there are so many pieces of legislation that are going to be coming through, the House of Representatives tends to kind of depend on other legislators. So they say, oh, you know what, I usually vote the same way that one over there votes, so let me see how he's going to vote for it, and I'll either vote, I'll vote along with him. Or if there's a legislator that this particular one says, oh well, I'm always against whatever he votes for, so I'm going to see how he votes and I'm going to vote against it. So that's like an informal way of doing it, of understanding what's going on. In the House, what they'll do, it'll be a show of hands. All of those that are going to be in favor of it, raise your hand, and then they'll count the votes. Then they're saying, okay, well, we have enough votes for it to pass or whatever. Then they will take the formal yay or nay vote to record that vote, whether or not it passed. So first, informally, show of hands, then formally press that button that says yay or press that button that says nay. That's the floor. Then when it comes to the floor of the Senate, they have more compromise going on before it ever gets to the floor. And so once it gets to the floor of the Senate, again, they'll do the same thing. Somebody will read it 3 times. They will debate it. They'll talk in favor of it or whatever. But what happens is that they'll be compromised before it ever gets to the floor. And so if they know that they have the cooperation of the lieutenant governor and at least 21 senators, they'll go ahead and introduce it, or they'll go ahead and schedule it for floor action. Or they'll say, all right, we have enough votes for it to go through. So the compromises are reached prior to floor action. If they don't feel that they have the votes, they'll go ahead and kill it right there. Okay, I talked a little bit about the conference committee already, and I said this is the way to resolve the differences. And so if a bill comes out where it's a little bit different versions of the House bill and the Senate bill, only one bill can go to the governor. So it goes into a conference committee. And so the conference committee is a very important committee because this is the one that's going to be able to resolve these differences. But before they ever meet, the people that are put on that committee, it's a big deal. It's a powerful committee. It's a big deal on who's going to be serving on that committee. And so they will try to reach a lot of compromises before they ever go into the committee. There needs to be a majority support of the committee members. So this is another way of saying it. So compromise is going to take place before it ever goes into the committee. So they'll know what the people in the House want. They'll know what the people in the Senate want. Then it goes into the committee, and they have to kind of do some deal bargaining over there too. And if there's no majority saying yes, this is a bill that's going to be coming out of this committee, this joint resolution is going to be coming out of this committee. If there's no resolution there, if they can't come to that compromise, it's going to be killed. That's another way that bill can be killed. So if there is a compromise, they're able to come up with some kind of a joint bill, then it's going to be advanced back to the floor. It's going to go back to all of the legislators again. Okay, so the bargaining process begins prior to the selection of the committee and during the deliberation process. And the thing is this, so it reports out of the conference committee, it goes back to the floor. It cannot be amended at that time at all. It cannot be amended. If it gets to the floor, they have to vote it up or down, yes or no, yay or nay. If it's defeated, that's it. It's killed. Alright, so let's go through the process of how a bill becomes a law then. In Texas, a bill can be introduced in either chamber or both chambers at the same time. It can be introduced in the House or it can be introduced in the Senate or both at the same time. Once it's introduced, it's assigned to a committee. And being assigned to a committee depends on whether or not they want that particular bill to pass. It goes into these subcommittees or the little legislatures for committee action where they actually do the work. They will rewrite the bill. They will take testimony, add sections to the bill, delete sections from the bill. It'll report out of committee. If it does not report out of committee, the bill is killed. If it does report out of committee favorably, then it goes to the calendar. It has to be placed on the calendar, and the calendar is a mechanism that advances these bills to the floor. So the House has one way of doing it, where the chair of the calendar committee decides which ones are going to go or not. They can be killed at that point. The Senate has a different way of advancing their bills, their calendar, and that's basically through chronological order. There is a way to delay it or to kill bills, and that is through the two-thirds suspension rule. Okay, so if it does advance to the floor, that is where the rest of the legislators, the House and the Senate, get to hear about these bills that the committees have been working on, and it has to be read 3 times. Time for deliberation. Votes are taken. Majority vote. If the bills are different coming out of the House and coming out of the Senate, then they need to go to a conference committee. And the conference committee is going to resolve these differences. And so once it reports out of conference committee, then it's going to go back to the floor where they will take another vote, a majority vote, if that's the final passage. And if it passes with a majority vote, then it goes to the governor to sign or to veto. Okay, so those are all of the procedural tools that give the lieutenant governor and the speaker of the house so much power. What you should have picked up from this part is that you see that they have a lot of influence in that they appoint people to the committees, that they will appoint the committee chairs, that the way that the laws are going to be coming out are going to tend to be more predictable because they're the ones that are appointing these people to start with. And so they know how the laws are going to come out because they know that the legislators know that the only way they're going to get a certain law through is to be is to have the support of the legislative leadership. So again, that should tell you it's giving them a lot of power in that way. Okay, the second type of power base that they have, they're called the institutional tools of leadership. And so I kind of introduced these already, so we're going to be talking a little bit more about them. So the first one I want to talk about is the Legislative Budget Board. And so in Texas, there's 2 budgets. The governor has one budget, the legislature has another budget. The one that does the budget for the legislature is called the Legislative Budget Board. And so what happens is this, the legislature meets every 2 years. And so before they meet, the Legislative Budget Board contacts all of the state agencies and they say, okay, state agencies, you have to let us know how much you're going to need each year for the next biennium, for the next 2-year cycle. So they have to report their requests. We're requesting this much money, we're requesting that much money. And so then by the time the legislature meets, when they go into session, they will say, this is how much Texas needs to run all of its public agencies. These are the expenditures. So they will say this is how much we need to be appropriated to run the state agencies for the state of Texas. So the Legislative Budget Board operates continuously. I mean, all the time. It operates all the time, and not just when the legislature is in session. Okay, so the membership for the Legislative Budget Board includes, let's look into the look at this. The chair is the lieutenant governor. The vice chair is the speaker of the house. They will appoint 4 members from each of the chambers, and they have ex officio members, which are basically non-voting members from finance, ways, and means. So they'll know what how much is Texas going to need in order to be able to run the state agencies. Now, as I said, this one operates continuously, and there is an administrative board, and they have a huge staff, believe it or not. And the people that tend to work in the for the Legislative Budget Board are basically people that have accounting degrees or have budgeting experience, that have like public budgeting experience, that have public administration degrees. Those they hire those types of people to work in this type of agency. And so what they do is that they assist the Appropriations Committee and their chairs in order to say these are the expenditures, this is how much you need to appropriate. And appropriate just means they need to be given this much money. You need to appropriate this much money. The other thing that they do is that they will oversee the expenditures of agencies and departments. So they have, I think it's monthly reporting cycles from each of the state agencies when they're saying, you need to let us know how much you're spending. Because if you recall, back when I talked about the Constitution, I told you that Texas can never run in the red. So they keep track of what's going on, of how much money is being spent. If they think that we're going to be running in the red, they will let the legislature know, the lieutenant governor and the governor know. And so all of a sudden, it's kind of like they will ask for what's called a budget rescission. And so what that means is that they will ask state agencies to give money back. When we went through that economic recession, the state agencies were asked to return money, and the first year that it was so bad that the economy was doing so bad, they asked Texas to return, listen to this, 12% of the budget. 12% of the budget. And we here at this institution did not see merit raises for probably 3 years. Interesting, right? But anyway, okay, so that's the Legislative Budget Board. The second institution is called the Legislative Council. And again, this is kind of one of those quasi-governmental institutions. And so what they do is that they will provide different types of information, data, policy expertise, and support to the legislature, to state agencies, or to other governmental institutions such as the federal government, because a lot of times the federal government or even the cities may ask for types of different types of information from the legislature, and the legislative council is the one that provides that. What they do is that they do primarily, their primary function is to provide research support to the legislators. And so let me give you an example of this. You know, uh, Texas in general at the state level does not have a law that says that you cannot text while you drive. However, different cities have passed ordinances that say you cannot text while you drive within the city limits. But there's nothing within the state, like if you're driving, on Interstate 37, that says that you cannot text. I don't suggest that you do that, but there's no law. All right, so there was a situation, and this was a couple of sessions ago because Rick Perry was still the governor at that time. And so they looked at the different cities to find out the different types of legislation that they had, the ordinances that they had. And so they liked the one that Austin had. The Legislative Budget Board said, you know what, Austin has a pretty good one. What we want to do is we want to make that a state level ordinance. So they drafted that legislation. They designed that legislation. They crafted that legislation. And so they introduced it to the Texas legislature. It passed, and it passed without many problems. So then it goes to the governor, and everybody was thinking, okay, well, this is a good thing. A lot of the larger cities already have this. It's a good thing that it's out on on the stretches of highway as well. Well, guess what? Rick Perry, who was governor at the time, vetoed it because he thought his rationale was this, or his thinking was this. He's saying he felt that it was too much of an invasion of a person's privacy that we do that. So he vetoed it. So as it stands right now, there is no piece of legislation that will regulate the texting and driving, outside the different city limits. And Corpus Christi does have an ordinance that says that you cannot text while you drive, while you are on city streets. But anyway, so this one, look at this, 17 members with the lieutenant governor's chair, with the Speaker of the House as the vice chair. Now the third one is called the Legislative Audit Committee. And I think everybody knows what an audit is, right? All right, so the state has one. And so he's the one that audits the expenditures for the state agencies and the departments. Well, in the state of Texas, we have what's called like a fiscal year, and the fiscal year is September 1st through August the 31st. So more towards the end of the year, like in maybe June or the beginning of July, they're saying we have to close out our books. And so we have to conduct our own audit. And so what they're going to be doing is that they're going to say that, whether that all of the expenditures are legal expenditures, because there's some things that if you are a state agency, you cannot really spend money on, such as like alcohol. You can't really spend money on any kind of alcohol in any of your functions that you have, if it's a university function. So then the Legislative Audit Committee will come in on a cycle as well, and they will go ahead and audit. They will audit all of the expenditures because, again, what they're saying is that you cannot use certain types of money for certain things in the state of Texas. The way that we have travel, like when we go to conferences, some pots of money can only be spent for this, other pots of money can only be spent for that. So they're looking at the pots of money saying that they were not spent, or that there was no misappropriation of funds. That's what that they said, that there's a fiduciary responsibility within this particular state agency. Okay, so the membership on this one is Lieutenant Governor's chair, the Speaker of the House is the vice chair, There's chairs of relevant committees that are going to be serving on this one, and that there will be a state auditor that's going to be appointed by the committee. So the state auditor, and each region, there's like many different regions in the state, but each region has an auditor, and then there's one that's the main auditor, and he's in Austin. And I do have to tell you one other thing about the audit. If they find that money has been misappropriated or mishandled, that person can be financially responsible, and if they don't cough up the money, there could be either civil or criminal penalties, and people could wind up going to jail over some misuse of funds. Okay, the last one that we're going to be talking about is called the Sunset Advisory Committee. And so the Texas Sunset Act was passed, and they basically said, we have to go in and we have to look at every single state agency on a certain cycle, and it's a 12-year cycle, and it has to undergo what's called a reevaluation. And so when they're going to be looking at it, they're going to say, this is what this state agency is supposed to do. Are they doing it? Are they providing the programs that need to be providing? Are they targeting the right population? Are they serving as many people as they say they're going to serve? They also look at the money part. And so this cycle, as I said, it's a 12-year cycle, unless something comes up where there needs to be like an emergency evaluation, and that's what it's called, an emergency evaluation. So let me give you an example of this one. About 4 years ago, there was a situation here in Texas, and this situation dealt with real estate developers. And so, if you bought a new house, there's usually like a year's warranty, or your house is warranted for anything that goes wrong with your house for the first year, the first 12 months. And the person that built that house, the home builders, that they will go ahead and that they will repair it. And if they didn't, you could take them to court. So then a particular state agency was created, and it was the TRFF, and I don't really remember what the TRFF stands for, other than it dealt with the real estate. And what that particular agency was charged in doing was that instead of taking it to court, that this agency would be like the mediator, that they would provide a mediation function between the person that bought the house and the house builders. Well, this kind of went on for 3 years, and it got to the point where there were so many complaints about this particular agency, because what they were saying is that, this agency has nothing but house builders on there. They have real estate developers, land developers, real estate agents. So just the composition of the committee, it's set up so that a person could never win, and you couldn't take them to court. And so they did one of these Sunset Advisory Committee audits, evaluations, and what they did is they said they found, yes, that's true. Every single one that has been heard, the person has never won. The house builder has always won. This is not fair to the person. So believe it or not, they recommended that that agency be terminated. They said this will no longer be your function. And so there was like maybe 2 or 3 three cases that they said, you can finish these up, but we're watching you. We are watching you. Sometimes an agency may experience a change in scope and or authority, or they may take parts of a program out of one agency and put it into another agency. So that's part of the evaluation process, that it looks at it, it reports whether you're doing, what kind of a job you're doing, whether you need to kind of tweak what you're doing. Sometimes it may be, well, there's something going on, and we need to go ahead and pass a law that's going to change the way that it is at this particular point in time. So there's many things that can happen with one of these sunset evaluations, and they're called mega evaluations, believe it or not. Okay, so the Sunset Advisory Committee is the one that enforces this act. There's 10 members, and so guess what? They are appointed by the Lieutenant Governor and by the Speaker of the House. So again, these institutional tools, because each of them is chaired by the Lieutenant Governor, co-chaired by the Speaker of the House, they're the ones that will appoint the people that are going to be serving on these committees. So again, this should be telling you that they have their finger in every single piece of the pie, both procedurally, passing the laws, as well as the administrative part. So this is what gives them so much power, much more so than the office of the governor.